All right, so today what we're going to be doing, guys, is we are going to be analyzing a research scenario. So we have looked at some research scenarios in the SAC we did earlier in the year. A research scenario is literally just looks something like this, okay? It can be shorter, can be longer than this. But generally what it is it just tells us a summary of some research or some experiment that's been conducted by a researcher or by a person or whoever it is, and basically tells us what they did, who was involved in the study. So hold on, let me get my annotation. So what the study was about, and that's usually mentioned in the first few lines of the scenario, and that's usually referring to the aim of our study or the purpose of our study there. The research scenario often also indicates who was involved. So who were the participants? Who was the sample, in other words? Okay. The research scenario also tells us extra information, such as whether the person got informed consent from the participants, what were the procedures and the processes that this person went through, what was the method that they undertook in order for the experiment to be conducted. And not in all experimental scenarios, but in most experimental scenarios, you'll get the results represented as some kind of data, either in the form of a table or in the form of a graph, okay? Both of these are possible ways that we can represent the data there, okay? Inferential statistics, just completely disregard the last line here. We don't do p-values anymore in psychology, so we don't need to worry about that statistic there. Okay, so this is basically what a typical research scenario looks like. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to maybe read through this yourself, and then we'll go through it together and then we'll annotate it. So I'll just give you a few minutes, probably like, yeah, just a few minutes to read through it. And in the meantime, I'll just pause the recording until we finish going through it. Recording first. Okay, so the scenario says Susan is a VCE psychology teacher at Glenvale Secondary College. She is studying for a master's degree in psychology. She believes that Unit 3 and 4 psychology students who have at least 4 separate study sessions for psychology each week will achieve greater expertise in psychology than those who have fewer than 3 study sessions each week. Now, why I've underlined these things here is whenever you see a number like 4 study sessions or like 4 minutes or 4 kilometers, it's always good to underline that because it might be helpful or useful for you when it comes to operationalizing the variables later on. Whenever you see the word believes, or she wants to investigate, or she is interested in researching, that probably indicates that there's some information in that paragraph about what the aim of the study is. Okay, so that's why that's important. There are 76 students. Again, this tells us something about the sample that she might be using in 3 classes at her school. So at the school that she teaches. So this gives you a clue as to what sampling procedure she might have used. Okay, Susan puts a notice in the newsletter outlining her proposed research and asks parents or students themselves, if 18 years or above, to sign and return a permission slip consenting to their participation. So we can see that there is some aspect of informed consent that's been fulfilled here. Each student is then asked to keep a study diary throughout the year. Susan considers that the study score for VCE psychology is a good indication of expertise in the subject. So we've already seen the word expertise in the subject earlier. We came across it here. So now we know that this is probably quite an important variable in our study, okay? And we can figure out what variable it is as we go through the study. Now, if you look at the results here, it says the results of Susan's research are shown below, okay? Shown in the form of this graph here, okay? Let me do that again. Shown in the form of this graph here. Sorry, not graph, in the form of this table here, okay? Where it shows you the maximum psychology study score, and in any unit 3 and 4 subject, the maximum score or perfect score that you can get is 50. So it shows you what kind of scores people got when they showed poor study habits, as well as what the group with good study habits got in terms of an average study score there, okay? So obviously Susan is tracking these students across time, okay, and she's tracking them until they get their final study score at the end of the year. So that's the basic idea of what Susan's study is about, and it's not too much, it's not a very complicated study, but it's important to be able to read this study, not just like read it blindly, but actually read it, and as you're reading through it, understand what it is that you're reading, understand what it is that Susan is investigating. Start thinking about things like, okay, what would the IV in this study be? What would the DV be? By looking at the results here, make a prediction, okay? What we can see here is that students who show, students who show good study habits tend to do better. They tend to get higher study scores. Okay, so we already have a clue about whether Susan's hypothesis was supported or not. Okay, just by looking at those results there. So that's the basic idea, and that's how you should always be annotating a research scenario, particularly a larger research scenario like this one. Okay, guys, now over to you to try these questions out. So the first question is, state the independent variable and dependent variable in operational terms, or basically operationalized. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip back to the previous slide because this is where our information is. So now what I want you to do on a piece of paper in front of you, or if you want to open up a new Word document or whatever, just write down the operationalized IV and the operationalized DV. Okay, and I'm going to try to make us do things under time conditions today. So I'm going to give you guys about 2 minutes now to write down or to state the operationalized IV and the operationalized DV, and your time starts now. Okay, so basically looking at the IV and DV, so these are the simple IV and simple DV there. And then when we're talking about operationalizing, it's in the brackets. It's just including any quantity related information like the number of study sessions or, you know, the kind of score. In fact, I'd probably improve the DV here by writing as measured by a higher study score out of 50. Okay, so I would include that information here. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Did anyone have any confusions with this question so far? No, all good? All right, cool. If you do, just let me know. All right, the next one. So state an appropriate research hypothesis. So again, I'm just going to flip back to the first slide. Okay, so you got the information in front of you. Now your task is to write down a research hypothesis, and it's worth 3 marks. Does anyone remember the memory tip that we use to write the research hypothesis? There's 4 things that we, not 4, sorry, 5 things that we need to include. And we used a specific memory tip to remember that. Yeah, iPod, and there's one last letter to that. iPod, and then one last thing at the end. And it's the thing I always tell you guys, don't forget, because they're just as important group than the other one.
Isn't it just C?
Yes, it's just C. So iPod C, yeah. The reason why we say iPod C is because we don't want to forget our control group. The control group are the group that basically make the experiment an experiment. They're the group that acts as a comparative, I don't know why I couldn't put the bracket there. Okay, they're the group that act as a basis for comparing the results of the experimental group. Okay, so without the control group, the experiment can't run. So that's why the memory tip is iPod C. And does anyone remember the 4 magic words, or those 4 words that we always start a hypothesis with?
It is hypothesized that.
Excellent. So it is hypothesized, or it was hypothesized that. Okay. So that's how we start our hypothesis there. Okay, those of you who might have forgotten what iPod C stands for, it stands for, just give me a second while I change this color. Okay, the I stands for the IV, or the independent variable. The P stands for the population, not the sample. Okay, just the general population there. The O stands for the operationalizing of variables. I'm just going to OP. The D stands for the DV. And the C stands for the mention of the control group. And how we mention the control group is we say, it is hypothesized that blah, 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 compared to participants who do not, blah, blah, blah. So the control group is always the group that is not exposed to the IV. They're not exposed to the good habits, for example. Okay, so in our study, the good study habit people are our experimental group, or they're the ones that are exposed to the IV, and the poor study habits don't have an IV. So this is our control group there. Okay. All righty. I think we have enough information there to write our research hypothesis. So I'm going to give you guys about 3 minutes. Okay, 3 minutes on the clock, and your time starts now. Okay, so that's basically why we always write the population in the hypothesis, not the sample. So just be really careful here. Who show good study habits. So that's our simple or non-operationalized IV. Okay, good study habits. So the red one is our simple IV or non-operationalized IV. The part in the brackets is our operationalization of that variable. So we're operationalizing the IV by saying, as measured by students having at least 4 separate study sessions, okay, each week. So that is our operationalized IV. And then what is that going to affect, or what behavior are we measuring for change here? It says that these children or these students who engage in good study habits will have higher expertise in VCE psychology, or better knowledge of VCE psychology, or better understanding, whatever word you want to use there. And that's our DV. That's our simple DV or our non-operationalized DV in the blue. Okay, now again in the brackets, I'm operationalizing that. So let me just use a different color, maybe purple. Okay, as measured by a higher study score, and you could say out of 50. Okay, that would be the operationalized DV. That's how we're measuring the DV. Okay, so the purple one is the op DV. Okay, and then the last bit is the last thing that we need, which is our C. In iPod C, we're looking at our mention of the control group compared to students who show poor study habits. And remember, we mentioned these are the guys who are not exposed to the good study habits. So they're not exposed to the IV there. So this is our control group. They are there for the basis of comparison. They don't receive the IV. They're not exposed to the IV. They are in absence of the IV there. So they're just used as a basis for comparison. Remember, we said CO for control, CO for the basis of comparison there. We use them just to see what the baseline kind of results would be like. Okay, so iPod C is basically what we use for our research hypotheses there. Okay, usually we never ask you to write a non-research hypothesis, like as in we don't ask you to write a hypothesis that's just simply with the variables not operationalized. Okay, you always need to operationalize those variables there. And that's why these kinds of questions are worth pretty big marks, like 3 marks is quite a lot because you do need to put in that detail there. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Any confusions, guys, about research hypothesis? If not, just put a thumbs up, or I don't know, put a raise hand or something, just to let me know that you're all good with that. Okay, and look, guys, I know it's hard. Honestly, writing research hypotheses is not something you're going to get good at just by doing 1 or 2 research scenarios. And for this reason, we are going to focus more on this next week as well. And I will probably give you a research scenario question or PowerPoint to work on over the holidays as well, just because we really need to develop our skills in this area. Okay, but it's not easy. It's not something that's going to come to you overnight. Okay, I remember when I was doing psychology, like it took a while, okay? And research method is not easy. It's actually one of the hardest areas. And the fact that it's boring doesn't make it any easier, okay? So now what we're doing, guys, is this is not an actual question as such, but we're evaluating the study now. We're brainstorming about the weaknesses of the study. So think about the study itself. Think about what kind of extraneous variables you think might have been in the study. And I'll go back to the scenario. Think about the potential confounding variables that were in the study. Were there any issues in terms of the sampling procedures that were used? Okay, what about the experimental design that was used? Okay, were there any issues with ethical principles being breached? Were participants put in any kind of harm there? Okay, so essentially what we're doing is we're taking this study and we're critiquing this study to the best ability that we can, looking at pulling it apart, looking at all the faults of the study, all the ways in which the results could have been affected in an unwanted way. Okay, remember we talked about this idea that when we talk about potential confounding variables or extraneous variables, these variables are bad for our study and we want to eliminate them because they affect our results in an unwanted way. So remember we said in any study, we want the IV to directly affect the DV. Okay, in this study, for example, our IV was good study habits, or, the presence of adequate study habits there. Okay, so if good study habits is my IV and psychology study score is my DV, psych study score, and this is like out of 50. So I'll just put a little bracket then, right? Out of 50. Okay, in a perfect experiment that doesn't have any extraneous variables or potential confounding variables, in an ideal world, I want my IV to directly affect my DV. I want the good study habits to be the main kind of cause, or the main kind of influence on the higher achieved study score. But obviously, we don't ever really have a perfect experiment. These guys always slip through. They always come in and they're like, yes, time to ruin the results of the study. Okay, time to confound the results of the study. And they're kind of like these evil variables that come in and basically affect the results in an unwanted way. Because now it becomes difficult for us to determine with certainty, was it the good study habits or was it some other factor that led to a better study score? For example, just to give you an example, some of those kids in that study might have got tutoring from outside, okay, but some of them might not have been able to afford tutoring from outside. These kids who are getting tutoring, that tutoring acts as a potential confounding variable, okay, because it's an individual participant difference. It's something that differentiates one participant in this study, in Susan's study, from another participant, okay? So that kid that gets good tutoring from outside, or, you know, has all these extra resources because they can afford them, the tutoring might play more of a role in increasing their study score rather than their good study habits to begin with. Okay, they might be lazy, but they're getting all this extra support out of school. Okay, and for that reason, the tutoring plays more of a role. And now Susan, the researcher, she can't actually say, oh yeah, I'm 100% sure it was the good study habits that led to the change in study score, because there's no certainty there that that is the reason. Okay, so just to revise our knowledge of how bad extraneous variables and potential confounding variables are for any set of results in any research experimental scenario that we're dealing with. Alrighty, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back now to the research scenario itself, and I want you to have a look at it for a few minutes, and you don't have to write a paragraph for me or something. All I want you to do is, on your piece of paper or exercise book or Word document, I want you to list down in dot points all the different variables or all the different unwanted variables, like potential confounding variables, extraneous variables, any other limitations of the study, like ethical breaches, all that stuff that could have basically taken effect in Susan's experiment here. Okay, so read through it again, skim through it again, and have a look at all the issues, all the faults, all the weaknesses and limitations of Susan's study. And I'm going to give you about 3 minutes to do that little brainstorm, and your time starts now. So yep, we've mentioned sleeping habits are one other factor other than good study habits that can affect the person's study score in an unwanted way. So that is a confounding variable for our study. Stress levels, excellent. So stress levels, example from family issues the person might be having at home. A student is not just living in school, you know, they're obviously, and even more so now, we're all e-learning from home. So, you know, family issues you're having with friends online, all that kind of stuff can affect your ability to get a good study score. Illnesses or sicknesses, excellent. So if a student there is suffering from a medical condition, that is going to affect their ability to experience or to be able to get a good study score there, because they might be having a lot of disruptions, having a lot of hospital appointments. Mental health issues in general, yeah, so things like anxiety, for example. Yeah, excellent. Some students have to work, yeah, so having a part-time job or having a casual job can affect time commitment. Okay, if you don't have enough time to study, then obviously you're not going to be able to exercise or practice those good study habits. Noise disruptions at home. Yeah, we have to remember not everyone has their own time. Okay, we have to remember not everyone has their own study room at home, or not everyone has a designated place where they can study. Okay, a lot of the time, if people are, you know, have a lot of siblings, for example, they might be sharing a room with a sibling. A lot of people might not have a dedicated thing because they've just moved to a new house, or they're currently in the process of moving somewhere else. So again, you know, your study space at home can affect your ability to study well, and noise disruptions can also play a role there. Okay, so that's basically looking at all the different, those are some really good examples, and those are basically all perfect examples of how the students in Susan's study could have been affected in terms of their, study score. Okay, all of these are factors other than our good study habits. So other than the good study habits that affect the study score. okay, and can actually trump the effect of good study habits, okay? A person's stress levels might overcome, even though this person is showing the best study habits they could possibly show, the stress becomes too much. The stress overtakes the effect of the good study habits and basically reverses all the efforts that the student has put in, okay? Guys, what did we think about the sampling procedure? What type of sampling do you think Susan used to select participants for her study? If you remember, there are three types of well, we got many types of sampling, but the main types of sampling that we've looked at are random sampling, convenient sampling, stratified sampling, and random stratified sampling. So which one do you guys think it is? Convenience, yeah, excellent. Okay, are there any issues with convenient sampling? What's one benefit of convenient sampling, first of all?
The benefit is that they're easier to pick out. Like it's easier for you to find.
Yeah, it's easier to pick out people. So we know that it's convenient sampling from this paragraph here. Okay, we know that it says there are 76 students in 3 classes at her school. So this tells us that Susan, who is a psychology teacher herself, is actually not recruiting students from another school outside. She's recruiting students from her own school. She's putting the notice in the school newsletter. So this is easy for her to use convenient sampling. Okay, and this is the clue that tells us that it was convenient sampling that was used. Now, what is the disadvantage, guys, of using convenient sampling? Anyone remember from Unit 1? Yeah, you can't generalize back to the wider population, because when we use convenient sampling, yes, Susan's 76 students at Susan's school have a chance to take part, but what about the rest of the students in the schools nearby? What about the rest of the entire VCE psychology student cohort that's doing psychology in 2021? Okay, none of them had an equal chance of being selected. Okay, and that's because convenient sampling does not allow for randomizing of participant. It does not allow for every person in a population to be selected for a study or for an experiment. So because we're not randomizing, we're not able to generalize those results back to the population. Okay, and that is the main disadvantage of convenient sampling. If we ever ask you to talk about the limitations of a study, you can actually write down, if convenient sampling was used, you can write down this point, that the sampling procedure used was convenient sampling. And although it allows for easy selection of participants, it doesn't allow everyone an equal selection or equal opportunity to take part in the study, okay, which means we can't generalize the results. In terms of ethical breaches, do we think that there are any ethical breaches in the study? First of all, what's one ethical principle that Susan did manage to fulfill in this study?
Informed consent.
Yeah, informed consent, excellent, because you can see here that she's clearly asked for participants' permission to take part, and she's given them the extra information that they need when it says outlined her proposed research. Okay, she's not just forced a paper in front of them and been like, oh, hey, can you sign this, please? Hurry up, hurry up. She's actually given them the extra information there too. We can also say voluntary participation, because it says all students agree to take part. So it kind of indicates that they've taken part willingly rather than being forced to take part, or rather than Susan going up to them being like, hey, take part in my study, or I'm going to deduct like 5 marks from your next SAC. So she hasn't threatened them in that way. So informed consent and voluntary participation have both been met. Is there any way, guys, you think that a study like this, which seems pretty harmless, could potentially maybe cause some harm to any of the groups of participants there? Okay, if you were in this study and you were in the poor study habits group, how do you think that might affect you, being forced to engage in poor study habits for the whole year until you get your study score? It might have breached confidentiality. Yes, we don't have enough information in the scenario, but we can make that assumption that maybe when Susan released the results, she didn't really privatize the results, or didn't really conceal the names of the students. It's a possibility there, yep. Another ethical principle we can talk about, guys, is not really physical harm, like we saw in the Zimbardo experiment where people were getting physically tortured and that kind of stuff. But we're talking about things like mental health. If I'm in the poor study habits control group of this experiment, and I'm usually a good student, and I'm being asked to deliberately engage in poor study habits and not study for as long as I would want to, that might actually take a toll on me, because as a result of that, my SAC marks might get lower. Okay, my SAC average gets lower, and that builds up stress for me, who, and I'm usually maybe a motivated student who does like to engage in good study habits, but as a result of taking part in this study, I have to engage in poor study habits. So that's one way we can probably say the participants were possibly harmed, okay, in a psychological or kind of intellectual manner there, okay? So that's the basic idea. Okay, so now let's go back to that thing and look at the sample answers. So this is just some sample answers there. Another thing that we could also talk about was the study diary. So Susan asked the students to keep a study diary, but again, just like any other self-report, study diaries can be falsified. Study diaries can lead to inaccurate reporting. So if Susan asked you to study for at least four study sessions a week, and you only did one, you might write in your diary, yes, I studied for 5 study sessions this week, even though you only studied 1 study session. Okay, so again, it's very easy to lie on something like a study diary, especially because you can't prove whether someone's telling the truth or not. There might have been other factors, and I think a lot of you mentioned this. So you mentioned about illness, you mentioned about stress level, some of you mentioned also about other assessments being held and the time commitments and all that stuff. So those were really good examples we brainstormed earlier. Another thing that we can mention is that although convenience sampling doesn't allow us to generalize the results, we need to also talk about or think about what are the ways we can control for that. So in the future, we might be able to use something like random sampling to ensure that everyone has an equal chance of being selected there. Okay, and even though that's not as easy to conduct as convenience sampling is, it comes with an advantage in the sense that generalizing of results is possible there. So this is just how we would take all those different points we brainstormed and put it into like an actual paragraph or actual explanation there. Okay, cool. So let's have a look at, oh, that's it. Okay, cool. Awesome. We finished on time. That's good. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording here.